Right. Coming out of Thanksgiving here. You guys feeling full? You tired of leftovers at this point? I'm kind of feeling that just a little bit. I think the Thanksgiving holiday definitely gives us a lot of reasons to give thanks, and we celebrate those things by eating, which I think is totally reasonable. It is good for us to feast. I think that's a biblical idea for us to feast in thanksgiving to God for all those things. We all love food, and over the years, one of the brilliant things that we have come up with is the idea of combining foods. We take one food that is good and shove it inside another food that is good, and it makes a food that is great, right? We take a hot dog, which is a good thing. We shove it inside cornbread, which is a good thing, and it makes a corn dog, which is a great thing, right? We take grilled chicken and rice and beans and salsa and cheese, and we shove all that inside a tortilla, and that makes a great burrito, right? We take other things like cooked fruit and shove it inside a delicious pastry crust, and we have a delicious pie, right? We like to put foods inside other foods, and this is a brilliant innovation of humanity, I think. And in fact, I heard that DJ and Sam celebrated their Thanksgiving this year with the ultimate example of this, which is the turducken. Have you guys heard of the turducken before? It is a chicken shoved inside a duck, which is shoved inside a turkey, and you cook it all together and make one big thing, the turducken. And it's a glorious testament to the goodness of our practice of putting foods inside other foods. And sometimes things are just better when combined with other things. And the reason I bring this up is that today, as we go into week 10 of our study of the Gospel of Mark, in the second half of Mark chapter 5, what we're going to see is sort of the turducken of Jesus' miracles. If you can go with me on this illustration for a second. This may very well be the worst introduction I've ever done, but here it is. The turducken of Jesus' miracles. What we're going to see is the story of one miracle with another miracle shoved inside of it. But even more than that, what we want to do is as we read it, as people who understand the gospel as a whole, we see the greater level of this outside miracle of the gospel itself. It informs the way that we read and interpret the story of a miracle shoved inside another story of a miracle. Is that good? Is this an acceptable introduction? The turducken of Jesus' miracles. So let's get into the story in just a second. We're going to be looking at Mark chapter 5, starting at verse 21. As we talked about last week, Jesus and his disciples had crossed the Sea of Galilee from the west side to the east side. There he met the Gerasene demoniac and really healed this man of being consumed with a legion of demons. And as you recall, after he did so, the people were so terrified that they kind of forcefully asked Jesus to leave. So Jesus and his disciples get back in the boats, and they go from the east side of the Sea of Galilee back to the west side of the Sea of Galilee, where they will continue to do ministry. This is likely the area of Capernaum on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. So look with me at Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to the first half of verse 24. It says, "And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, 'My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live.' And he went with him." Now, while Jesus may have been rejected on the east side of the sea, here on the west side of the sea, he is welcomed with open arms. Remember, he had done a lot of ministry in this area before, probably in and around this area of Capernaum. So he was pretty well known. His teachings and his miracles had been heard and seen by many people. So as soon as he steps off of the boat, he is met with a lot of attention. And here we're introduced to a special character. This person's name is Jairus. As it says, Jairus was a ruler of the synagogue, meaning that he was likely a person that was in charge of the operations of this local city's synagogue. He's kind of the facilities manager of this place. He was not a Pharisee. He was not a scribe. He was not a master of the Jewish law. He was more of a logistics guy, managing the functioning of this synagogue. But because of that, he was important. He was likely somewhat wealthy and definitely recognizable in the community. Jairus had some status. So he, as a man of status, was able to confidently make his way towards this Jesus. Through the crowds that were gathering around him, Jairus makes his way to Jesus because he is desperate. And at the same time, he's bold in his approach. And we see that he is confident that Jesus can do what he's asking. He falls at the feet of Jesus, begging him to come and lay hands upon his dying daughter. Now, we don't get any indication here of what his daughter is dying from. We don't know what's killing her. We just know that she is very near death. And this man Jairus is broken because of it. As any loving father would, Jesus calls his daughter his little daughter. But as we'll see later, she's actually 12 years old, which at this time and in this place is nearly marrying age. But a father will always think of his daughter as his little girl. And Jesus, in his great compassion, agrees to accompany Jairus and see his sick daughter. Now, the need of Jairus' daughter is sort of the first layer of miracle. But as I said, there's another miracle stuffed right here in the middle. So let's continue on in verses 24, the second half of 24 into 28. It says, "And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, 'If I touch even his garments, I will be made well.'" Now, before we talk about the woman, imagine for just a moment the stress that Jairus must have felt at this point. He was in a hurry. He needed Jesus to come right away and see his dying daughter. There was no time to waste in this. And now, the crowds are pressing in around him and Jesus. Those crowds are slowing them down, and Jesus needs to get to his daughter quickly. What if Jesus doesn't make it? This is the kind of stress that Jairus would have been feeling in this moment. And within the crowd that's pressing in on Jesus is this nameless woman. She also is desperate in her suffering. And again, we obviously don't know what is causing her problem of bleeding. It could have been a menstrual disorder, or it could have been even a uterine hemorrhage. But not only was it unpleasant and unhealthy, but according to Jewish law, because of the thing that she was suffering from, she was ritually unclean. Very much like the leper that we saw Jesus heal way back in Mark chapter 2, this woman would have been excluded from polite society because if anyone were to touch her, they also would have been considered to be unclean. Adding insult to injury, she has also spent all of her money on doctors, and none of them have been able to bring her any relief. So, like Jairus, she also is desperate. She has suffered this way for the entirety of Jairus' daughter's life. But unlike Jairus, who was able to come to Jesus confidently and openly, she approaches Jesus secretly in a great display of humility. So the woman reaches out in humble faith, thinking that if she can only get close enough to touch Jesus' clothes, that she will be made well. Now, while that belief may seem somewhat superstitious and strange, considering how we view Jesus and how he works, it's actually not unfounded. It's possible that she may have heard from somewhere else that just touching Jesus' clothes could heal people. And this is why we know that. Look at Mark chapter 6, verse 56. We'll get to it when we get to it, but skipping ahead, it says this: "And wherever he came, in villages, cities, or countryside, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and implored him that they may touch even the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well." So this was not necessarily an unusual occurrence. She's not being superstitious and wanting to do this. She believes that just getting close enough to touch his clothes will make her well. But we know it isn't the magic robe that is healing people. It is the power of Jesus. And as we will see, the faith of the people who come to him is what makes them well. So let's continue in Mark chapter 5, verses 29 to 34. It says, "And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, 'Who touched my garments?' And his disciples said to him, 'You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, "Who touched me?" and he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Imagine for just a moment what it must have felt like. She felt the miracle happen inside of her. In her physical body, she felt her cells and organs answer to the call of Jesus. She felt the miracle happen and healing take place inside of her. And somewhat strangely, it tells us that Jesus even felt that power go out from him. See, oftentimes in the Bible, you'll read something like this and you wonder what in the world Jesus is doing. But I want you to understand, it's not unusual for Jesus to ask questions in the Gospels that we know that he knows the answer to. He asked, "Who was it that touched me?" But we can agree this healing was not an accident. It wasn't a mystery to Jesus. Tons of people were gathered around, pressing in on Jesus, trying to touch him and get close to him. And yet he knows every single one of their hearts. And he knew the faith of this woman. So when he knew well the faith with which this desperate woman reached out, and yet he asked, "Who is it that touched me?" And again, I think we should understand that in this layered story of miracles, we are meant to keep in mind Jairus. They are in a hurry, and now Jesus is not only slowed down by a crowd, but Jesus has stopped. They didn't have time for this. Who cares if someone touched your robe, is what Jairus must have been thinking. But this woman matters to Jesus. Sure, the healing was a kind and generous miracle, but I think what we see here as Jesus singles this woman out is another act of mercy and compassion. Here, publicly, in the middle of a great crowd, and despite the fact that they are hurrying to help someone else, Jesus takes a moment to see her, to know her, to care for her, and bless her. And as she trembles on the ground before him, all that she has to confess as she tells him the whole truth is that she believed that if she just touched his robe, that she would be made well. For Jesus, there is no reason for her to apologize. In a moment of loving compassion, Jesus says to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." So one of the beautiful things we see in this miracle inside of another miracle, the first blank on your sheet is this. By faith in Jesus, this woman is healed and restored. Her faith has made her well. Her life is changed forever. Jesus is the Son of God. He is God's presence among his people, and he has called her daughter. More than just being healed, Jesus has also restored her in her community. She will no longer be outcast as someone who is unclean. She can have peace, and she is identified now as an adopted daughter into the family of God. It is a beautiful miracle story here within another miracle story. And Jesus is reminded of the first miracle very quickly. Look at what happens in Mark chapter 5, verses 35 to 37. It says, "While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, 'Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?' But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, 'Do not fear, only believe.' And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James." So Jesus is literally interrupted as he hears this news, and Jairus hears the thing that he dreaded most. His daughter is dead. They are too late. Perhaps if the crowds hadn't slowed Jesus down so much, or perhaps if this woman hadn't touched his robe, if Jesus hadn't stopped, maybe they could have made it there in time, but they haven't made it there in time, and now his daughter is dead. And you can just imagine all the what-ifs that would be running through Jairus' mind. And even the people that are with him say, "Look, why bother Jesus any longer?" And in this dark, tense moment, Jesus speaks with calm, peaceful clarity and says, "Do not fear, only believe." And you have to admit that must have felt a little bit ridiculous for Jairus. What do you mean, don't fear? His worst fear has just been realized, The thing that he feared most has happened. He has just received the worst possible news. His fears weren't just present, they were confirmed. She was dead, and death is permanent. There is nothing that anyone could do. So then, Jairus must be wondering, what exactly is it that I am supposed to believe? What do you mean, don't fear, just believe? And this noticeable tension that has taken place here in the story seems to have been enough to disperse the crowd that had been pressing in. So Jesus then requests that they continue onward to Jairus' house and that only Peter, James, and John go with him. So look back at the story of Mark chapter 5, verses 38 to 40. It says this. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in to where the child was. So we don't actually know how far away Jairus' house was from where they were, but whatever distance it was enough time for the word to spread and for mourners to gather. It had taken time for the messengers to go and tell Jairus and Jesus that his daughter was dead, and it took them time to get there, and in that time, many people had gathered. And understand this, these people were not going to jump the gun and proclaim that someone was dead without knowing for sure. They were not so uneducated or inexperienced to think that someone who was in a coma or unconscious or sleeping was dead. No, they had checked and confirmed, probably multiple people, that this girl was actually physically dead, and then they gathered people to mourn her death. So they were weeping and wailing loudly in despair. And we can admit that Jesus' response here seems somewhat strange. He says that she is not dead, but only sleeping. Some people, when they read this, equate Jesus' statement that she is only sleeping with other passages in the New Testament in which people who have died are described as fallen asleep. 1 Corinthians 15 does this, 1 Thessalonians 4 does this as well. Indeed, in those instances, physical death is equated with being asleep before a believer wakes up to eternal life when Christ returns. So some people read it like that Jesus must admit that she's only sleeping in the sense that one day she will awaken to eternal life. Other people claim that Jesus is saying this because he knew and understood that she wasn't actually dead, that she was unconscious or maybe in a coma. I don't really know why we would believe that. I think we have sufficient evidence to believe that she was actually dead. I don't think either one of those explanations are sufficient for what we actually see happening here. In my view, I don't think that's what Jesus is referencing here. It seems to me that Jesus' light-hearted response seems to indicate that for him, her death is no more severe than being asleep. For Jesus, and only for Jesus, is raising someone who is dead back to life as easy as waking someone up. In his great power and authority, death has no more hold on a person than a heavy sleep. That's why he says this. And Jesus goes on to demonstrate this as the story continues in verses 41 to 43. It says this. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. Again, here we see Mark highlight the compassion and care shown by Jesus. In what's somewhat of a strange literary move, Mark quotes specifically the Aramaic words that Jesus spoke to the little girl. Talitha cumi is an Aramaic phrase. Mark is writing in Greek, and yet he gives us this detail almost to just show us a little bit of accuracy and detail to add to this intimate interaction. His original readers may not have known entirely what this phrase meant, so he translated, telling us that it means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And as the verse points out, the little girl is 12 years old, again, almost marrying age. Most would not have considered her to be a little girl, and yet Jesus addresses her as such to show his great kindness. And at his word, This little girl who was dead gets up and starts walking around. At his word, even death is reversed. What was understood to be impossible has been accomplished by Jesus simply speaking life into a girl that was dead. Now we can ask ourselves, did the girl have so much faith as the woman who had touched his robe? Did she come to Jesus with that same kind of faith that would make her well? Well, we don't see any indication that she did. In fact, as we saw, most of the mourners told Jairus not to bother Jesus with this issue. Most of them had no faith that this was even possible. And why would they? Death, as they understood it, is a permanent condition. Maybe Jairus had shown at least some shred of faith in that, even allowing Jesus to come and see his dead daughter. But I think what we see here is this. In what is kind of a comparison to the woman before, who was healed because of her great faith, what we see here is that the girl is raised back to life simply as an act of grace. So the next blank on your sheet is that by the grace of Jesus, the young girl is raised to life. And because of the way that these two miracles took place, with one happening in the middle of the other, while both absolutely highlight the kindness and the sympathy and the compassion of Jesus, I think we should also kind of consider the comparisons being laid out here. Jairus was an important member of the community. He had high standing. The bleeding woman was a nobody. Her name isn't even mentioned. Jairus had enjoyed the great blessings of his daughter for 12 years and now faces utter devastation. The woman, on the other hand, had suffered long, for 12 whole years, in the same kinds of suffering, and now was absolutely hopeless. Jairus came to Jesus publicly and confidently seeking help. The woman, on the other hand, snuck to Jesus privately in humility. However, the woman is healed publicly where everyone can see and know what Jesus has done, and instead Jairus' daughter is healed privately with only a few witnesses around. And despite all of those differences, what I want you to see is the beautiful consistency of Jesus. Jairus' public position didn't matter to Jesus, nor did the woman's humble position. The duration or the severity of their sufferings were not taken into account. Jesus came as God's presence to heal, to redeem, and to raise to life. And that is exactly what he displayed for us on this day. And again, we see this miracle inside of another miracle through the lens of the greater miracle of the gospel for us. These two smaller demonstrations of Jesus' miracle-working power ought to point us back to what we know to be true of the gospel of Jesus. And this is what that is. The next blank on your sheet is that we also are saved by grace through faith. Hopefully we all know this well because it's presented very plainly in the well-known verse, Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, saying, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and it is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." While the woman and Jairus both came to Jesus with real, legitimate needs, we should understand that neither of them could rightly claim that they deserved to be healed. Jesus demonstrated that neither of them had priority over the other. He would do what he came to do, and neither of them deserved what he offered more than the other. They were both sinners just like us. This is a difficult truth that we should often return to. Understand me clearly when I say this. A holy God owes us nothing except the right and just judgment for our sin. A holy God owes us nothing. Just because we have a need does not make us entitled for God to meet that need and intervene. And even further than that, none of our own merits make us worthy of God's saving either. God's healing, God's help, God's salvation are always and only a reflection of God's love and grace displayed to us through Christ, never a reflection of our own worth. As I've taught before, For those people in our world who may think themselves to be a good person, for those who think that their good has outweighed the bad, they should understand that your good is never good enough. We're talking about a holy God. Our good is not good enough to merit our own saving. And yet, for those who think of themselves and understand, I have done wrong, I have done bad things, I have sinned greatly against God, and some people may think that I have certainly done too many bad things. God can't save you. For you, the message is this: your bad is not bad enough to prevent Jesus from saving you. Every time, salvation and healing are always and only an act of God to us and for us, not by us. We should always understand the stories of Jesus' healings as echoes of his own mercy and grace. In the story of the woman and Jairus' daughter, we are clearly seeing an act of God's love and God's mercy, not a story of anyone earning his favor. And the same is true for us in our own salvation. Think of Romans chapter 5, verses 7 and 8 that tells us this: For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would even dare to die. But God shows his love for us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. The biblical idea here is clear. There is no one who is righteous, not even one. There is no person who by their works is deserving of the Son of God healing them or raising them or especially dying for them. But God has shown his own love for us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. It is by grace that we have been saved, through faith in his Son, not by any of our own works. By faith, the woman was healed of her bleeding. But Jesus would do even more than that by bleeding for her in his own crucifixion. The blood that he shed on her behalf would make her a daughter of God forever, and the faith that healed her would secure for her a place in eternity. Jairus' daughter was raised from death to life, but Jesus would do so much more by giving his own life and being raised from the dead himself. And if Jairus and his family continued in the faith, they would join in that same resurrection with Jesus. While they were still sinners, Christ died for them. By his sacrifice, Jairus' family could live for eternity. Hopefully you can see these miraculous stories are symbolic of the greater story of our own salvation. They're not only examples of what Jesus can do, but they remind us of what Jesus has done for us. The compassion shown to the woman and Jairus' family are only a hint of the compassion and sympathy that Jesus has shown to us. Think once more this morning of the passage from Hebrews that we open our service with today. Hebrews 4:16 said this: Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Our salvation, like the story of healing that we have seen today, is an act of the grace and mercy of Jesus. So the last blank on your handouts this morning is this: we can approach Jesus with the humility of the woman and the confidence of Jairus. We should know and understand our sin well. We should know that we are found guilty before God. Our good isn't good enough to save us, but our bad isn't also bad enough to stop him from saving us. So we should approach Jesus with humility, knowing that it is only by his grace that we are saved. But at the same time, we can know that God, being rich in mercy, has shown his great love for us, and that he has sent Christ to die for sinners like us. His work through Christ is thorough and complete, so we can also approach the throne of grace, as it says, with confidence, having faith that Jesus can and does help us in our time of need. So let your faith be strengthened this morning. Trust Jesus in humility and confidence. Let's pray together as we finish for today. God, we are thankful for for these beautiful stories and what they display to us about the goodness and work of Jesus. We're thankful for all that he has done, not just in healing these two people, but in achieving something so much greater. God, you healed the woman who was bleeding, but you have healed all who believe by shedding the blood of Jesus. God, you raised Jairus' daughter back to life, but God, you have raised so many more because Jesus himself was raised. Help us to believe and trust that the same is true for us, that by our faith, your grace can heal us and can raise us back to life.